It's time to be woke. Take off your shades. It helps see through the smoke. Cause the wicked hide behind the cloak. And if you stay in the mist, you gon' be soaked. So listen up, cause this hair of the dog. What's real, what ain't? Is this the fog or smog? Cause there's a difference when you breathe it in. So don't let the corporate media take you for a spin. This that morning show, they put you in the know. So I hope that you ready, cause all we do is go, go, go. Yeah, come get your info, you gon' be like, whoa. Hair of the dog, we bout that, ayy. We in the zone, we out here, yeah. Speeding the fact.
Morning, everyone. Welcome to Hair of the Dog. I'm Andy Kennedy. It is Monday morning. Thank you very much for tuning in. We have a really big show for you today, so I'm going to get right to it. Carrie Barber, good morning. How are you this morning?
Hey, good morning, Andy. Good morning, everyone. Today is definitely Money Monday, and let's get started. There's a lot to talk about, and we're going to have a very, very special guest join us a little bit later in this program. But for right now, let's start with the trees of the forest, and then we'll back up a little bit. And a lot of us went through this last year. It was just horrific for so many reasons. Some of us lost friends and family members. Some of us lost our homes. Some of us were evicted. Just one thing after another. The trauma that went from beginning to end, and many of us are either still going through or about to face. And that's what we want to talk about today. So deep breath, everybody. What we're going to discuss is a transfer of wealth. So most of us know it on a cerebral level. Some of us actually experienced it. And some of this is actually happening in a staged approach that you may not have recognized. So I want to cover some of those for you today. Just a kind of summation for you right here is interest rates were low, but the federal mortgage agencies raised refinancing rates. So we'll cover some of those. Ironically enough, they raised the rates to exactly $1,400. Does that number sound familiar? Yeah, $1,400. So basically it was your stimulus money and you were the pass-through, and it went to your mortgage lender and the two big agencies that we're going to talk about in a minute. Those two agencies had a phenomenal year, and we're going to talk about how your higher rates actually help them achieve that. And then we'll also talk a little bit about forbearance and what that means for whether you own a home or if you own a multi-rental property, if you are a landlord. Then also, of course, evictions are still happening. So
Or own a bear.
That's exactly right. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So, Andy, this is the first graphic, and I think this one really kind of tells the whole story, right? So we saw the headlines come out last week. For anyone who happened to notice, they said foreclosures fell to record lows. Well, yeah, there's a reason why, right? So on this particular chart, I've highlighted the Great Recession, and this, of course, comes from ATTOM Data Solutions. They aggregate all this data for Wall Street Journal and a bunch of other publications. So I have included my links to all the sources here so you can go through it. But you can see in the Great Recession, we had just under 3 million foreclosures. That was a lot. That was a lot of assets, housing assets that were transferred to the banks away from the individuals, families, things like that. So here you can see at the bottom of this chart is 2019 and 2020. Those are those last two dots. And you can see that the foreclosures fell, but part of that was because of the CARES Act and the forbearance. So what the forbearance was is you could take up to a year where you were trying to get yourself back on your feet, maybe not paying your mortgage, paying the note on your multi-rental property. But when that forbearance ends, not only do you have to make up that regular payment, but the principal every month that you missed in the time period before. So if that was a year, you've got a year of nearly double payments. That's a lot, particularly when we're looking at jobs numbers and we're looking at continued income inequality. So those two red charts, those red bars at the end there, those are the numbers of mortgage holders. These are people, homeowners, who are 90 days past due. More than 90 days prior to the forbearance coming in. So
I'm no expert, but that looks like a lot.
It's a lot, and it's far more than the Great Recession. And here's the happy fun part: nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody knows. So you'll see in all of the Wall Street Journal and I particularly went into investment publications, mortgage investment publications, to see what they think. And they honestly have no idea, because this is uncharted territory. It looks like things are stable. It feels like things are stable, but it all depends on where these homeowners are when the forbearance period ends. Will they be able to refinance? Will that just flood the market with open homes and assets and just too many? It really all depends. So this is something that we really want to watch. But one of the things I thought was pretty interesting as I was delving into this particular topic was these two credit agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So Andy, if you wouldn't mind this next chart, you've heard this term before. If you hold a VHA, FA, or you bought a house, or you know somebody who's bought a house, these two agencies, they're kind of a quasi-government agency. And I did include a link so you can go read about them. But Fannie Mae purchases mortgage securities from the big banks, the big ones, Wells Fargo, Chase, things like that. Freddie Mac typically does it from the smaller lenders. So between the two of them, they are securing these mortgage assets. Well, they now own about 90% of new mortgages. And by own, I mean they're actually securing it, as these mortgage swaps are still happening. So what they're doing is they're guaranteeing the value on a whole bunch of these mortgages. Does any of this sound familiar? Because I feel like we did this in 2008 and 2017.
It does, doesn't it? When we had all of these problems and banking people and mortgage houses all acting badly. Don't tell me it's still happening, Carrie.
It's still happening.
Oh.
It's still happening. So they are now securing about 90% of new mortgages since 2000. I think it was 2008 was the data that I looked at. So yeah, this is the privatizing profits and socializing risk. And that's what you see here with these companies. But so they're for-profit companies, which is amazing to me. How can this be? Well, here they are. So one thing that they decided to do to slow the amount of refinancing that was happening. So if you were a homeowner, you lost your job because of the pandemic, or that you had an illness, or suddenly you had to pay medical bills or for a funeral, how dare you? You might have gone to refinance your mortgage to take some equity out of your mortgage, or maybe you were just trying to keep your head above water. So what these companies decided to do was, about in August, September, they announced rate hikes. So these were the rate hikes that they were giving to your lender. And the lenders, of course, pass that on to you as a consumer. So it was about 0.5% of your mortgage, or that worked out to the $1,400 that I mentioned. So your stimulus check went directly from you, paid into that fee. And that's where that went. So, but here's the really good news. Because you as a consumer were charged that extra amount unnecessarily, these two companies actually earned record profits for the year. It was amazing.
Yay.
I know, we're thrilled. So Fannie Mae, record profits in the fourth quarter and for the full year, they pulled in 11.8 billion with a B, billion. Freddie Mac, the smaller one, pulled in 7.3 billion with a B.
But small b.
Smaller B. It's still big to a bunch of us. So in those numbers, here's what I thought was very telling, right? Of Fannie Mae, the refinancing, 3.4 million were single family homes. Your mom's house, your dad's house, your house, that type of thing. Almost 1 million of them were multifamily rental units. Why would I touch on the multifamily rental unit, right? We've got an eviction crisis.
Yes.
And this is the piece that I really wanted to focus on. So while these two companies were making bank off refinancing and costing you more money, they're collecting all of the net benefits for themselves. But what was going on with the people who are the landlords? Were they suffering? Were they having a hard time? And if you were on social media at all, you would see these people who were calling themselves landlords freaking the hell out, because they're like, if you can't pay your rent, if you get a rent forbearance or you get a rent, I'm screwed. So I went and took a look at this. And here's what I found. This was amazing to me. Multifamily rental markets were steady, flatlined, no issues. Specifically, it is being reported that 98.3% of apartment loans were current, no late payments, no nothing as of August 2020. And that was an increase from the prior year. So I broke down all the numbers and I put those in the chat, but just so you can understand this, in September of 2020, 91.8, we're still collecting rents, 91.8, and this is nationwide. So you had evictions going on across the country. And Andy, this is the last graphic. I'm getting ahead of myself here, but
not a problem.
These evictions were going on all across the country. Some states didn't even adhere to an eviction moratorium. There were 7 that had 0 protections whatsoever. But then other states had a little bit of it. And here's where it really kind of broke down, is 43 states passed their own eviction moratoriums, but many of those statewide bans were only in place for 10 weeks or less. And again, 7 states didn't pass anything. So you had multiple evictions going on. At the same time, these landlords were making bank. They were not hurting. And this is data that is collected from their own industry, from their own investors. This is a big ticket market here. So when we're looking at the small people, the little people, you and us, we're getting it left and right. And yet all of these other people at higher levels seem to be getting a little bit more of the assistance and bailout. And then in the corner of this particular graphic, I want you to pay attention to Eviction Lab. This is a project, I want to say, Princeton University. Eviction Lab at Princeton University is a bunch of students, economics. They identified around 80,000 evictions in just the 27 cities that they track. So they're not tracking every city, but what I love is how they've organized the data here, because they were looking at major cities, that's Cleveland, Houston, Tampa, New York, and they looked at September, October, and November, where all of those really big numbers were coming from. And they've categorized all of this data beautifully on the site so that you can see it. So go out and take a look at it. But here's the problem. You've got the forbearance ending shortly. You've got evictions still full tilt. And then we just had the CDC's guidelines, which aren't even binding, overturned in federal court. So this to me, and I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is just another massive transfer of wealth. What little wealth the 98% of us hold is being sucked up yet again, right? It's not trickle down, it's going straight up to the top. Happy fun times. So,
yes. Isn't it lovely?
So yeah, these are things that you need to be aware of as we go forward in this year, because hopefully things are going to get better, particularly from a pandemic standpoint, from a family stability standpoint. We're already starting to see that in the decisions people are making for themselves about the job market and what actually is valuable work, and is it worth their time for a crappy job away from their family, or can they hold out for more? And I'm encouraged by those things, but I want you to be aware of what is happening here in, the too big to fail financials.
Absolutely. So, I love the debate that's going on right now about people putting help wanted signs. We can't find workers. We're going to pay poverty wages, but we can't find anybody that wants to work for that. They would rather stay at home and make more money. Okay. If your takeaway of that is that people are lazy, you've got the wrong take. Okay. The takeaway should be that people should be making more money than what they can get for not working.
Yeah, I think the people who are saying that they're lazy have never run a business, so they don't understand. And if you are a business owner in whatever world you think that this is a valid argument, I would suggest to you that there are business incubators at your local community college, universities, your chamber of commerce, because you really need to retool your business. I have never run a company where I didn't pay less. I've never paid less than $15 an hour. In fact, I would argue with people that you are worth far more than that and you need to rebid this particular job. Because I understand how business works. And if your model relies on sabotaging other people, using other people, then you have no right to a business. Clearly.
That's correct. That's correct.
Clearly.
I agree 100%.
So without further ado, let's just welcome our guest. So we are so thrilled, and it's such a privilege to welcome Rohan Grey, who's the Assistant Professor of Law, as well as the President of Modern Money Network. So Rohan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we were exploring a little bit about the CARES Act, and there's an interesting provision in here that helps with the financial markets. So Andy, you and I were talking about it. Do you want to set this one up or go right into Q&A with Rohan?
No, I think we should get right into it. But I think a lot of the trepidation that people have about what even the CARES Act is. So I think that's probably a good starting point. What the CARES Act did, what it earmarked certain funds for, and who are the benefactors of that. So could we do a brief overview of that, Rohan?
There's a lot going in there. I don't want to sort of pretend to provide a complete summary of a multi-hundred-page bill, but there were various forms of protections for individuals, for businesses, for city and state governments, for certain sort of industries and sectors, and for our purposes, perhaps most importantly, for the financial sector, and particularly certain funds that were earmarked from the Treasury for use by the Federal Reserve as a way of offsetting or cushioning any losses the Fed might take in providing even more support. And so the sort of, when these large bills get discussed in the public, they often get reduced to a particular price tag. People say, oh, this is a $1 trillion bill or a $2 trillion bill, whatever it is. And that price tag becomes a sort of indicator of how serious it is, how comprehensive it is, all those kinds of things. And one of the things that was very unique or sort of very significant about the CARES Act was that there was a pot of funds, I think roughly about $500 billion that was earmarked for the Fed, not intended for the Fed to use those funds because the Federal Reserve doesn't need any additional sources of funding outside of its own balance sheet. But it was a way for the Fed to be able to engage in more risky activity, with the Treasury basically saying, if you take any losses, we will cover those first losses, almost like a shareholder would. And so what started off as sort of $4 trillion or $400 billion, sorry, the sort of implicit assumption that was baked into the act was that the Fed would then be able to leverage that by 10 times that amount. And that number, that leverage ratio is basically arbitrary, but that was the number that got settled on by policymakers in the sort of popular discourse. So what that allowed was for President Trump and Congress to say, okay, this is a bill that only costs, sort of a certain amount of money, but in fact can be leveraged to provide many multiples of that amount in relief. We can talk about that more in detail, but when you sort of think about what the CARES Act was from the perspective of financial system support, it was less about the numbers on the page than that larger augmented number that the Fed used, that the Fed was supposed to use, I should say, based off the amount that the Treasury provided as a sort of backstop.
Right. Excellent. Okay. So now, based on a podcast that we did at the end of November with Bob Hockett, and trying to understand how successful the CARES Act was for helping the entities that it was supposed to, he seemed to be under the impression that because Steve Mnuchin was basically the keeper of the CARES Act and was the final say in who got what, and the number of stipulations of that were in place to see who qualified for it, that it really didn't end up helping many people at all. Can you talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, I mean, so there were a number of programs that had sort of allocated pots of money that were not taken up to the full extent. You know, some were to do with funds available for small businesses, things like that. But you know, perhaps one of the more notable ones was the municipal lending facility, which was really intended to provide relief to state and local governments through the Fed, which was something the Fed has actively resisted doing and basically didn't do it in the 2008 crisis, because the Fed, you know, likes to consider itself to be apolitical and not in the business of picking winners or losers or sort of second guessing public policymakers. Whereas if you're going to be helping city and state governments, then it sort of begs the question, you know, under what conditions, in exchange for what conditionality and reforms, etc. So rather than try to help and get into that messy world, the Fed sort of basically just said we didn't want to help at all last crisis. In this crisis, it was untenable to do that. They had to get involved, but they designed this facility not to sort of, you know, provide free money or anything, but to provide lending at rates that were supposed to be cheaper than what was available in the municipal bond markets at the time. But they designed the rules and conditions so onerously that it was extremely underutilized, barely taken up at all, and sort of almost more insulting than anything else in terms of sort of, you know, with friends like these or with support like this, who needs anything else? But you know, basically the idea, as I mentioned earlier, that sort of 400 billion was going to be leveraged into 4 trillion didn't come close to being materialized. There was a lot of unused capacity, and there was a lot of kind of building imperfect facilities and then blaming people when they didn't get taken up fully, rather than really being responsible for getting all of the available support out the door to where it needed to go. So, you know, I don't think it's entirely on Steve Mnuchin. I think he played a huge part. I think it's a lot of it, particularly when it comes to those Federal Reserve facilities, is on Fed leadership, who have a lot of discretion, a lot of autonomy, a lot of independence on how they do those, how they make those decisions. And a lot of it was just on the way that Congress designed the bill in general. You know, there was direct cash relief to people to a very limited amount. But in general, those kinds of direct supports, you know, that sort of idea that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, it usually is not how Congress thinks, right? If you can make things more convoluted, if you can, you know, do with tax credits rather than spending, etc., that's often what ends up happening. And so programs that could be 5 pages in legislation become 25, and things that could be a 1-page application process become a 12-page application process, and things that could be, you know, we'll give you money and we'll work out the details later, become 12 hoops that you have to jump through before you can be eligible, etc. So, you know, when it comes to the CARES Act, I think somewhat ironically or counterintuitively, there was a point at which it was politically valuable to give the impression you were doing a big thing. You were doing a lot, right? This is a serious crisis. We're taking it seriously. Whereas in practice, in fact, those big numbers were often hollow, right? It was sort of like me sort of saying, I'm going to give out $1 billion to the community, but then I create one little stall at the top of a mountain that nobody can get to, and it's open for 2 hours on a rainy Friday. And then they say, oh, look, nobody wanted free money. Oh, well, I guess that's it. I offered $1 billion, you know, only 100,000 was given away. And it's like, yeah, you made it so that was a sort of doomed to fail program. And I think that's a fair criticism that can be levied at various parts of the CARES Act, whether it's the Federal Reserve facilities or certain other facilities. Yeah.
Gary, do you have anything that you would like to ask? Are you
Yeah, I want to get back to the security. So for everybody who's watching, it almost sounds like too big to fail happened all over again. And what all of that account and that gyration was meant to stabilize investors. Like, it really didn't have a whole lot to do with me as an individual. Do I have that right? Am I wrong? What was that about?
You have it generally right, but I think we got a little bit of nuance there. I think the way to think about it, I think, is less about individual investors and more about the financial system. I think one of the things that they learned in the 2008 crisis is a crisis in a particular market or in a particular instrument, or even a very large crisis across multiple sectors, can balloon out and become a massive global systemic crisis if it causes problems with liquidity or the interdependence of institutions. And I have plenty of criticisms about that. I have plenty of criticisms about the entire too big to fail model, where we privatize the gains and socialize the losses and all those kinds of things. So there's no apologetics coming from me on that front. But I think the lesson that the Fed learned in 2008, 2009, for better or worse, was that whatever else happens, you have to get the financial system working. You can't let any other kind of crisis transform into a financial system crisis. And that means making sure that there's enough liquidity going into the financial system, and that the various sort of institutions and lending facilities and all the kinds of intertwined, overlapping layers of credit and derivative support, et cetera, that different financial institutions provide to each other every day, don't get completely unwound in one of these crises moments. And that's something the Fed did do this crisis. I think, pretty unequivocally, it didn't morph into a general blown financial crisis. It was a crisis of people's incomes. It was a crisis of business. It was a crisis of employment. It was a crisis of inequality and of real human suffering. But it wasn't a crisis of the financial system jamming up. There were a few moments from the treasury markets last year and things that were really more minor technical matters. But the minute this crisis was on the horizon, the Fed just threw, a wall of liquidity, to use Treasury Secretary Geithner's line, at the problem. And it meant that whatever the things going on at the time, one of them was not the sort of financial system melting down. Now, the downside of that, of course, is that was a huge amount of free liquidity, free money. They took on to their balance sheet assets that were supposed to be private sector risky assets, corporate debt, right? Various forms of repos, things like that. They lent against assets at discount rates, at haircut rates, sort of like risk-adjusted rates of collateral. You go into a pawn shop and you want to, pawn your wedding ring to get some quick cash. There's no risk that your wedding ring is going to suddenly, collapse or burst into flames. If you go in to get cash and you pawn a financial instrument, there's a risk the financial instrument could become worthless, right? The underlying mortgage could collapse, etc. So the Fed, rather than sort of really look at that risk, just basically said, yeah, we'll take it on face value and give you the cash because you need the cash so much right now. And that amounts to a huge windfall, right? That amounts to a huge handout. But it's not a handout in the sense of kind of, you got a check and it was like a free money on the side of the street. What it was sort of treating garbage like gold, or treating something with a 10% risk premium as having no risk premium. And it's a sort of almost invisible form of subsidy, because the Fed can say with a straight face, with an honest face, well, we're lending against collateral, right? We're getting something in exchange for what we're lending. But the question is, like, what are the conditions that you got that on? What is the quality of that asset relative to the price that you're offering, or the amount that you're offering? And across the board, what the Fed did was, as it did in 2008, is it made these instruments safer by offering to do that, right? Any risks that could have come up in that market that might have meant those assets could go down in value and things were muted. The volume was turned down precisely because the Fed was backstopping those risks, right? And that was the real handout, I think, of this crisis when it comes to the financial sector. Is everybody agreed that even if we couldn't agree that about anything else, should people be homeless? Well, it's a difficult question. Should kids get food? Oh, it's a difficult question. Should we make sure that banks don't suffer a liquidity crisis? Absolutely. Everybody's unanimous. First vote on the day. And that's what comes through to me with this CARES Act.
This just feels like deja vu, though, right? And I appreciate your explanation, but it feels very much like the disconnectedness of the majority of people in this country and what we went through over the last year and will continue to go through, as opposed to investors, Wall Street, and those people who get to write these policies. They're in an entirely different world.
Yeah, I mean, someone like Jay Powell, was a former banker, and there's a number of politicians who go in and out of the revolving door with these banks and things. But again, I think it's less helpful to think of it in terms of individual investors, and more helpful to think of it in terms of sort of institutions and sectors, in the sense that I think a lot of these people are very, very scared that if the financial sector stopped working, the sort of engine of American capitalism would shut down. It is that too big to fail idea. But it's too big to fail in the sense that finance is like the electricity companies. If there's one thing that can't happen is the electricity turns off across the whole country. If there's one thing that can't happen, it's banks stop, working. You can't access your money. That would be the ultimate failure of the economy in their view. And so it's less about sort of individual investor can't be wiped out. There's a bit of that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not sort of saying there's no grift or sort of preference for rich investors. But I think that the structural concern here was banks and financial institutions need to be saved first, or they need to be saved no matter what else, right? That's above politics. Starving children, that's politics. Saving banks and saving payments operators and saving hedge funds and saving money market funds, that's almost sort of engineering. And that's the ideology. That's the politics in that moment, is to exceptionalize this one area. And you see other examples of this, right? No matter how much concern there is about the budget and deficit sustainability and all those stupid things that we know to be stupid, when the time comes to fund the military, everybody puts their hand up without question, right? Whatever other priorities there are, whatever worries about burdening our grandchildren, all those kinds of things, they come a distant second to, supporting the troops, making sure we're number one militarily, all that kind of thing. And that's what's happening, I think, is that CARES Act made sure that wherever the messy political fights were, it was not in that sector about preserving the banking and financial system.
Right. And I think that's very important point, but I also want people to understand that what we know about MMT and the lens that shows, and the pandemic has made abundantly clear, if only you have your eyes open to see it, right? That the whole congressional fight for $2,000 versus $1,400 and trying to get up money in people's pockets, is a ludicrous thing when you understand how it really works, right?
I mean, it's ludicrous in the sense that they could have afforded it. It's ludicrous in the sense that there's absolutely no inflationary risk, on either side of that problem. I don't think that anybody who opposed giving more money really thought that the problem was inflation. They just didn't think it was fair. But I think it does go to that question, which is, I like this line that I use a lot when I teach law, which is, the law is kind to the rich and just to the poor. When it comes time to the banking system, right, everybody agrees it would just be unthinkable to let the financial system collapse. And I might agree with that. I don't think that blowing it up overnight is necessarily the best way of dealing with all the problems. But then when we get to those other questions, it's a sort of much more complicated. There's reasonable views on all sides that we have to consider, et cetera, et cetera. And it's that double standard where the ideology and the power comes into play. Right, it's that double standard where we're haggling over giving people $600, but if a bank or a financial institution came with a garbage financial asset and said, "Hey, let me get this converted into cash with a non-recourse loan, which means I never have to pay it back. You just get left holding the collateral," and it's dog shit, frankly. But give it to me at full face value. They'll say, "Yeah, sure." That single asset could be worth $10 million. And nobody is complaining about giving that person $10 million more than they deserve. Nobody is complaining about giving 100 people $10 million more than they deserve in those moments. You say to them, are you actually assessing each asset? No, of course not. We couldn't do that. Wouldn't work. Well, why do you think it's the right way to do it with human beings? Oh, well, that's
exactly
different. That's different. That's the hypocrisy. And also, when it came time to actually providing this support, for example, with the municipal lending facility, the assumption wasn't we're going to give these cities and states money. They gave a little bit through the CARES Act, but when it came to the Fed's facilities, it was we'll buy up the loans at a slightly cheaper interest rate. Right? Even in this world of unlimited money, etc., it was still loans and interest, and we will adjust the market rate of interest. Everything was framed through this scarce money, credit not spending. You know, we can tinker and push at the edges of markets, but fundamentally markets are in the driver's seat. That was the narrative. And if you say to someone, hey, why can you spend $4 trillion through these facilities, but not just give $4 trillion directly in a much more clear and transparent way? And then, you know, if you need to tax it back on the back end or whatever else, fine. There's no good answer to that other than it was easier budget politics. It was easier for us to hide these numbers, you know, in the Fed's balance sheet. Again, which is ironic because at the same time, they're trying to show how big these numbers are as proof that they're seriously responding to the crisis, right? But the end result is, okay, it's the Fed that makes these decisions. It's not spending, and it's discretionary, and, you know, you have to go through all the hoops of repayability, or at least the veneer of repayability as part of the criteria. And again, the simplest, you know, shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. You need to put money in people's pockets, put it in their pockets. Don't play dumb games with financial collateral. Don't play these games with, you know, interest rates on 30-year bonds, etc. Just give them the money and let them use it for the things that are needed. And when the time comes to deal with equitable, you know, allocation distribution questions, deal with that on the back end. When we wrote the ABC Act with Rashida Tlaib, that was about providing people with, you know, cash relief on a monthly basis, which was, you know, one part of a larger relief vision. One of the things that we included in that bill was a provision to establish a commission to work out the effects of the pandemic on inequality and to make a broad suite of recommendations of things, including changing in spending levels and taxing and other things to deal with the inequality exacerbating effects of the CARES response and the COVID pandemic itself. And we wrote it like that specifically because there would have been no way to practically make this one program, these $2,000 month checks we were talking about, inequality neutral in isolation from everything else. You know, when we were designing it, we thought very seriously. People said, is giving everybody the same amount of money the right thing to do? You know, isn't that a handout to the rich? And what we said is, look, this whole pandemic is going to be a handout to the rich. This is a power grab. No crisis goes to waste. They know how to play this game. They are going to be grabbing every bag they can. This tiny little amount here is small change compared to all the other grifts that are going to appear in this crisis. And if we're going to deal with those things, if we are going to try to build an economy that is more equal and equitable on the other side of this pandemic than at the start, we need to look at it all holistically. We cannot look at each individual program and say, oh, this program was sort of, you know, took a little bit from the top here and this, and therefore it's neutral. And then we add it next to another neutral program and then another neutral program. And we put 5 of them together and it's a neutral recovery package. Absolutely not. You know, that's fake. That's delusional thinking. This crisis is going to exacerbate all kinds of painful inequalities, and it's only by looking at them all together on the other side that we can really start to deal with the systemic problems at play.
Right.
And the same. Sorry, one second. The same is true with the financial stuff, right? Even if they are 100% correct, which I think they're 100% correct, they may be more than 0%, but I don't think they're 100% correct. That it was important to protect the financial system from exacerbating this crisis with a whole nother layer of collapse. That isn't the same thing as saying all we need to do is protect them from collapse, and then after the pandemic, just keep going about daily business. Right? We protect them in this crisis, and then afterwards we have a serious reckoning. We've had 2 once-in-a-lifetime events in one generation, that both of which resulted in massive, too big to fail bailouts of industries that were earning massive profits even during the pandemic. So we need to think really deeply about what it actually means to have a financial system that is going to be bailed out like this, and what it actually means for where the right balance of public and private ownership, accountability, governance, resource allocation is. And I think that's something that those people who were chomping at the bit to make sure that financial sector support came in that very first minute of this crisis don't give a shit about. They won't be there for that conversation. They don't care. When the money's flowing towards Wall Street, they care. When the time comes to talk about accountability and implications for public ownership, etc., they're nowhere to be found. And again, that's where the ideology is. That's where the power is. That's where the outrage, to me, stems from, or should stem from.
Do you see any change with the new administration in terms of being more serious about putting a kibosh on the financial fraud and the crime that we saw that led up to 2008?
No. Short answer is no. There's been some. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Biden is still building out his financial regulatory team, although the fact that it's taking so long is in and of itself is a problem. The head of the OCC still hasn't been appointed. Some of the others haven't been confirmed yet. And there was a point at which, for example, the OCC nomination was going to be a guy named Barr, who is quite crypto friendly. Gary Gensler, who is often seen as a more kind of critical, tough-minded regulator, is quite pro fintech. In general, I think, to the extent that there's going to be any sort of regulatory crackdown, it will be on these emerging fintech sectors. Someone might want to take a chunk out of one of these crypto companies for unregistered securities activities, or to go after Tether for its stablecoin activities, or to go after Facebook's new currency DM, just to show that the government, isn't going to let Facebook dictate everything, even if they end up giving them most of what they want anyway in the long run. But when it comes time to litigating the financial fraud of 2008, absolutely not. I don't think there's any interest at all. I don't think that Jamie Dimon's reputation has taken a hit in this last year. I don't think that there's anyone pushing for any scalps on heads or kind of relitigating the MERS fraud or anything else. If anything, I think the sort of antitrust private concentration of power movement that is growing and really, I think, could get some scalps in this administration. The appointment of Lena Khan, for example, to the Federal Trade Commission is very, very welcome sign. Will come in tech sector. It will come with Google. It will come with Facebook. Those are the scalps that I think they really want to get this cycle. I haven't heard that. Maybe I just missed it, but I haven't heard any serious attempts to go after financial frauds outside of maybe a few of the smaller fintechs.
Okay. In your opinion of Janet Yellen as the Fed chair?
I mean, I'm on the record. I think she prematurely raised rates in 2016, which, when you're the Fed chair, is pretty much one of your biggest jobs. Obviously, she's part of a board of governors there. It's not just her, or she's part of the Federal Open Market Committee. It's not just her, but she's also the Fed chair, and there's a long historical tradition of votes not rolling the Fed chair. So if she really sort of wanted to stand and die on that hill, I think she could have played things very differently than she did. And, whatever the excuses are about the forces beyond her control, she was in the driver's seat. She was in the leader's chair at a time when they did the wrong move, when your job is sort of pretty largely not to do that one thing. In general, before that, she's been a huge defender and theoretical proponent of the idea of the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. She talks regularly about R-star, the idea of a neutral rate of interest. That is to say that, if you could only get past that pesky zero lower bound of zero interest rates, if you could somehow break that barrier, then we could find an interest rate that if you held on to that rate would sort of balance full employment and stable inflation. So this sort of idea that there's one thermostat with the interest rate, that if you can move that thermostat enough, the temperature of the whole economy will change the way you want it to go. And she's been a pretty proud deficit hawk. She's been on the board of the Fix the Debt and Pete Peterson Institute. She's given numerous public appearances and announcements talking, even a year or two ago, talking about how the federal debt is unsustainable, how the size of the deficit is unsustainable. Newspaper reports have come out in the last few weeks that Biden's commitment to quote unquote, fully paying for his new infrastructure bill was driven in large part by Janet Yellen, demanding it to be as such. So, bad on interest rates, bad on unemployment, bad on deficits. It's a pretty bad trifecta to be the head of the Treasury.
Certainly not a good for the future, for the next few years anyways.
Yeah, I mean,
especially right now. There's
this terrible habit of comparing everything against the absolute worst, and people do it in electoral politics. Or you can't criticize the Democrats because the Republicans are so much worse, or you can't have any criticisms of the candidate because, my God, Trump could get in, or whatever else. And in those moments, it's always presented as this unique sort of once in a lifetime moment. Just right now, just for this one situation, just bite your tongue. But in fact, it actually happens over and over in every context. Well, you can't criticize Chairman Powell, even though he's a Republican millionaire, former banker, who's also been a deficit hawk and terrible on financial regulation and other things. You couldn't possibly criticize him because relative to every other Fed chair we've had, he's been very dovish. Well, okay, relative to a world of blind man, the one-eyed person is an eagle, but that's not the right comparison. And when it comes to Yellen as well, this idea that she's sort of been a center-left dove for so many years that we should all kind of bite our tongues and be grateful that she could be so much worse is just a terribly fatalist way of letting the Overton window be moved by other people. And frankly, she's, by any objective measure, if you didn't give someone that name and just describe that track record, it's bad.
Yeah, and it doesn't. What does it mean in terms of human life, in terms of people, trying to survive during a pandemic, right? With climate change and catastrophes looming on the horizon, right? And
I think relative to Biden's, political ideology or political position, which is, I think, pretty centrist. And, you look at his track record over his 40 years in the Senate, when I say centrist, I mean relative to the political climate. And he's tried to tack to the center of the Democratic Party, wherever that party happens to be. So he's very much a weather vane politician, not a true north politician. Tony Benn famously said, there are some politicians that will always give you true north, and there are some politicians that will give you where the weather's blowing at any point in time, and he's definitely the latter. And so, the fact that he hired Yellen and those kinds of things is a sign that he is not going full hawk. He's not going that full other thing. It's not Peter Orszag, or it's not, it's not Robert Rubin, or it's not some of these other sort of absolute terrible hawks who also call themselves Democrats. But for progressives, right, for the left, it's not at all our champion. I mean, imagine if somebody had said, hey, you're the left, you're the progressives, you could put anyone in the Fed chair position. Who would you have? And you said, well, I've got this guy who's a millionaire Republican former banker who thinks deficits are unsustainable. How about that? You go, what? Are you in the wrong room? The Republican meeting's next door. Why the hell would we hire this person? Exactly. But now that's the kind of narrative you're hearing. Well, we don't want to rock the boat. It could be so much worse. Well, like, he's doing some good things. It's not our job to be an apologetic for the status quo. It's our job to be pushing it in the right direction. And whether it's Yellen or it's Powell, it's not the right direction. Right.
Carrie, do you have any other questions for Ron before we let him leave?
I'm just truly terrified. As I'm listening to all of this, it went from cringeworthy to nothing fundamentally will change.
Well, I mean, that was his election promise, wasn't it? Yeah. I will say, though, I think one thing that is optimistic is the economic narratives and the very serious people that kept a stranglehold on these discourses for generations, for 20 years before 2008, and then kind of held on to it even as it was slipping out of their grasp after 2008, are not gone. Unfortunately, they didn't all get on a bus to Cabo and get hit by another bus on the way there or something. So they're still alive, still around. Larry Summers is still like a bad fart, just sort of wafting in the corridors, even though he hasn't got any official job. But their status has been greatly diminished. We are in a transition period right now where our theories, our narratives, our arguments, our visions of how this stuff should go have an equal validity, not equal chance of passing, not an equal political base yet, but they have an equally valid claim to accurately describing reality. We are not the crazy Marxists who have not, had their finger on the pulse for 40 years. Not that I have a problem with Marxists, but that's sort of the narrative that was prevalent for a whole generation. We're not people who are so far removed from power we don't understand the nuances of what we're talking about. We're not people who are trying to question 30 years of empirically, verified economic science. This is a period where everybody is scrambling to try and work out what the hell is going on, what's the new normal, what are the things that matter, what don't, what are the constraints, etc. And I think a lot of us, certainly MMTers, I think are ahead of the curve. They've been thinking about some of these problems for a while, and reality has proved that the things they thought were the important questions have been the important questions in this crisis. But even putting that aside, even putting aside the head start of just thinking about these things properly that I think we have, we're at a stage now where, the average politician, the average talking head, the average journalist, even the average person on the street is trying to work out what the hell all this is talking about, what the hell all of this that people are talking about it means. And we get to be one of the competing options on the table now. If you think about that sort of first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, and then you win. Right. I think we're very firmly in that third phase. And not only are we in that third phase, but we're in a third phase where, they were fighting from the higher ground. Sort of some medieval show and they're on the top of the hill and we're sort of chasing up the hill. It's a bad position to be fighting from. Their hill has been leveled. They may still have the bigger army. They may still have better weapons. They are not fighting from the top of the hill anymore. They are not fighting with the combined inertia of 20 years of it all kind of working okay for most people or whatever, or that being the perception. They're not fighting from this unassailable fortress of economic science. And that's what gives me hope, is that, we're in a more chaotic period, but in that chaos is also the breakdown of status quo inertia.
Absolutely. There's a reason why the deficit myth is still at the top of the New York bestsellers list.
And even just yesterday, I think, or even maybe it was this morning, Paul Krugman penned a piece saying, well, those MMTers are actually not as left-wing as I am, because they want to raise more taxes to deal with inflation, whereas I think we can use higher interest rates to deal with inflation. So for however much spending you want to do, I'm offering you the ability to do that with even lower taxes in the MMTs. So I'm even more left-wing, which is kind of ironic because most of the sort of Marxists who criticize MMT say it's because we're being too generous on taxes and saying you can keep taxes lower than they want to raise them. And of course, Paul Krugman, as usual, has misrepresented MMT because there are a whole range of ways to manage demand beyond just raising taxes, including things that the Federal Reserve could do through credit regulation and things like that, that aren't just about mechanically adjusting that one interest rate like a thermostat. But the fact that he even feels the need to sort of position himself to the left of MMTers as a sort of signaling device, and the fact that he is being forced to, whenever he talks about this stuff, to talk about MMT and to deal with them, it's a different world now. He has lost the authority of being the voice of the liberals, that everybody turns to. And now he is doing the opposite. He is walking into our room and telling everyone to look at him and look at him and look at him, which is a nice shift in mentality. In fact, a Republican from Indiana, Senator Braun, stood up in the Senate about, Wednesday this week, Tuesday, and went on a long tirade against MMT with a resolution trying to condemn it. And he said, this House has been embracing MMT with its funding and all these things, all of us MMTs would say, well, we wouldn't be doing it this way. This is not what we call MMT. But in their mind, we've won.
Yes.
I wish that was the case, but in their mind, the big question: can we run deficits? Is money printing, quote unquote, inflationary? Is the relevant constraint the size of the deficit or the productive capacity of the economy? We're talking about semiconductor shortages and lumber shortages. We're not talking about the interest rate of national debt. We're talking about those things as the relevant constraint. In their mind, we're living in an MMT world. So we're not living in a Paul Krugman world. He's not the enemy of. He's not the one to fight now. There was a point where he's the face on the shooting range target that all those Republicans want to be putting bullets into. It's not the case anymore, right? No. If you know us by our enemies, the right sees us as the enemy now, and hopefully that's because we are.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rohan. Always a pleasure to talk to you. I just love our conversations every time.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And, keep up the good work.
Okay, thank you. Take care, bud.
Phenomenal guest, and we are so privileged to have him here with us. If you didn't catch what he said when he talked about Rashida Tlaib and this legislation, he was working on that. He was fighting for us. Is what he was doing. So thank you to Rohan, wherever you are at this point, but amazing guest, even if I think it started negative, but then I feel a little bit better when he was talking about how the dynamic has shifted a little bit, and people who have a credible understanding of how money actually works at a federal level, maybe the days of forced austerity are coming to an end, maybe.
Yes, I posted on Twitter a couple of days ago that the Republicans are still screaming about the federal debt and how irresponsible it is to pass on this debt to our children and grandchildren, while at the same time denying climate change, which is destroying the only place that they have to live.
Irony. It's classic. Absolutely. Same people who told us that we were supposed to die for the economy are now worried about our grandchildren. Which is it? Which is it?
Yeah. The same problems that we see with U.S. government that are more concerned about people overseas and human rights when they don't give a shit about their own people in their own country, right? So, fortunately, we are going to change the world a little bit at a time and make this and save ourselves from ourselves and make it a more just economy. And so, Carrie, what do you think? Are you with me? We going to do this or what?
Well, this is why we do what we do. This is why we get up early, and then you and I, we could be doing absolutely anything else. All our viewers could be doing absolutely anything else, but they're here. So thank you so much for tuning in. Please share this information. It was a little heavy, but I think we can all elevate ourselves to this particular level. It's a conversation we need to have. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Carrie. Great job as usual. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Monday, and we will see you bright and early on Wednesday morning. Bye-bye.
We bout that, ayy. We in the zone. We out here, yeah. Spitting the facts, how it's supposed to be. Hair of the dog. We keep it ninja.